Hi, I'm Paul Gerardo from Catalyst Resources. I want to spend some time with you talking about the issues that are required to successfully design and develop the UI, either for your next application or release. The comments that we're going to be making today all relate to serious business applications, not websites. Over the past 20 years, Catalyst has designed about 400 applications. And what we have found is when organizations sit down to address a new application or a new release, there are typically 8 questions that need to be addressed, 8 issues. We're going to spend about a minute on each one of them. The first one is, what's the tracer bullet path through my application? What we mean by that is what we've discovered is if you, in almost all pieces of software, is if you looked at where 80% of the users spend 80% of their time, there's a relatively small number of key work areas, typically 4 to 8, where if you design for those and optimize for those, the application is much, much easier to use and much easier for people to understand. It's like designing a house where you first said, well, tell me about your bedrooms, tell me about the kitchen, tell me about your bathrooms. And if you get that part of the house correct, there's a good chance that much of the rest of the house will fall into place. Now, once you understand where your 80% of your users spend 80% of the time, the next thing is really to understand the competitive environment that you need to deal with. The issue is you need to understand who you need to beat, obviously. You need to understand who you need to match, who might be alternatives, and who you need to emulate. Now, in terms of who you need to beat, here's a piece of software that was for monitoring traffic patterns via the sensors that you see across the highways. It was professionally designed. There were good things about it, bad things about it, but we needed to understand what were the pluses and minuses here, and how were we going to capitalize in order to create real competitive advantage. We also needed to think about, well, what are the alternatives? Are there some other things that could be used? For example, if you've got a finance accounting system, could people just use bill pay? And then the other issue is, what things could you need to emulate? If you had a piece of software that had a lot of content in it and displaying content, and you were going to share it with people or have people who were Pinterest users using it, they may have expectations and be favorably predisposed to it if it had characteristics of Pinterest. So once you take a look at the marketplace, then the next thing that you want to take a look at is you want to have an honest look at your own software to see what the real situation is. Obviously, getting feedback from your users is probably the most valuable, but there are also some quantitative things you could do. The piece of software that you're looking at right now is the software that was installed in Jefferson County schools at the Columbine High School after the shooting at Columbine. It's an emergency notification system, and within about less than a minute, you can notify thousands of people who could be students, faculty, community members, emergency response personnel in multiple languages. Now, if you look at this piece of software from a Six Sigma analysis, there are 26 controls that a user might have to interact with to do that emergency recording. 16 of them relate to the work, 10 do not relate to it. So from a defect perspective, there's about a 38% defect rate. Now, if you were to look at the updated design, what you see is there are 22 controls, fewer controls to understand. All the controls relate to the work, so effectively there are 0 defects. Once you get a sense of where you stand and where the market is, then you want to sit down and think very carefully about some strategic issues. There are a lot of things that play into the strategy for design and development for the UI in an application, and there are overarching issues that could guide the development effort and the design effort. Let me give you an example. One of the most powerful ways to simplify your software is to identify mental models that will harness previously perfected expertise. On the right-hand side, you see a medical team looking at a patient chart. They've all looked at patient charts for years. They know exactly what's in there. They know how the information should be presented. They know how to use it. When we designed the software that you see in the background to allow for medical professionals to use tablets to access patient information and evaluate it, we designed it as if it was a patient chart. And when people picked it up, they immediately knew what to do. Once you have a strategy in place, then you need to think about, well, what is this essential functionality and how do you need to organize it? Sooner or later, you'll have a ScreenFlow map that looks something like this. And what I would venture to say, if you don't have a ScreenFlow map for an existing piece of software, you probably have a lot more screens in there than what you need. The key thing is this is like a floor plan for your software, and the important thing is to organize it based on the mental models and the proven design patterns. One of the most significant things that's happened in modern web applications is the ability to reduce the number of views required. In this example here, there were about 64 views to begin with. When we redesigned it, it had 32 views. Now, you can look at a lot of charts, you can look at a lot of diagrams and stuff like that, but sooner or later, people are going to say, what's this going to look like? It's important to get a sense of what it looks like. So, a visual design gives you some sense of what it looks like. Now, here is the response to this application that was monitoring traffic. And this was the competitive response to it. So what you can see here is there's a lot of data and it's dark. Now, a couple reasons why it's dark. One is when we validated it with users, users preferred the dark background so they could see the data. The other issue is typically in high data environments like air traffic controllers or trading systems, the rooms are often darker. The screens are much darker. And the reason is that you want the data to come alive. But with this visual design, not only did it give you a feel for it, but it also gave you a feel for how the software was going to operate, what it was going to be like, what the interactions were going to be like. So the next issue is, what's the optimal technical architecture that you have to put in place to implement this? Now, if you are a VP of development, you're constantly looking at diagrams of this. You're a director of development, and it's an N-tier architecture, and you know a lot about infrastructure. You know a lot about databases and business object and web services. And then there is this UI client-side stuff that at best is a little unclear because there are a lot of different technologies that aren't very complex, but together make things very complex. We like to think of it that there's about a 10 to 12 point checklist to define the presentation layer architecture for an application. Any of those things aren't tremendously complicated, but you have to understand each of those. Once you have this architecture in place, then you really need to put it to work. And putting it to work means that you find a way to define your UI in terms of modular reusable functionality. So in this case, what you see is a view divided into panels. Panels have services that send data to them. The services access the data from objects. That whole path that you could see along the top, from the top panel to the service to the data object, is reusable. It significantly reduces the development time and the amount of skill level that you have to have in place if you could have these pieces of reusable functionality. And it makes it so you can get to market faster and you could deliver greater functionality. Now, the last thing is, once you've answered those questions, is, okay, how long is it going to take? How much effort? What's the cost? And obviously, what you ultimately need to move toward is a plan where you've got it well laid out. You understand the resources, the schedule, the investment. Now, what we've found is that, again, most of the organizations that we have interacted with need to address these issues one way or the other. So Catalyst has a fast track UI workshop where we will customize this specifically for the application or release that you're focused on. We use a team of experienced UI designers and developers, and we do this and validate it with users over a period of about 21 to 30 days. If you want to learn more about it, you can visit our site, catalystresources.com.